office bearers of the Chartered Financial Institute of India, the office bearers of the Pune chapter, corporate executives, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. It is soon going to be a decade since I retired from active service, and I'm not too sure that you will find what I have to say extremely contemporary. But the reason I accepted this invitation was because I thought you might get some value in terms of the principles and the processes that go behind any change. So I am grateful to the Institute that they invited me here. And as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, SEBI was established in 1992, but it was only in 2000 that the first amendment to the listing agreement was made, whereby the issue of corporate governance came into kind of the regulatory space. And one would wonder, why would this be? And what is this corporate governance all about? So I thought I might start right at the beginning. While we think of governance as a very serious and complicated subject, in some sense it is very simple, and in some sense it is a lot of complexity. So when we as kids just decide to play a game, we have to decide on the rules that will govern that game. We may have evolved our own game. It may not be an established game. Yet, we must agree to abide by certain rules. Then only can the game go on. So there is an element of governance there. And what is this governance all about? It is any team activity that human beings want to take up will involve governance. So when in the hunter-gathering stage of mankind, when human beings decided that it is better for 5 people to hunt together rather than just one person, they had to decide who is going to drive the animal in a particular direction, who will hit the final shot, and so on. And if any one of them broke the rules of the game, the whole team suffered. So, implicit in this understanding is the principle that the individual decides to subordinate his self-interest to the interest of the team as a whole. And if we look at governance from that point of view, it is a very simple concept. As you get into the practice and you try to implement things, because the structures are complex, the concept can also get complex. But at the basis of all issues of governance is the ability to agree on a certain set of rules and then to follow those rules so that as a group we benefit, whereas at times, for the short term, some individual in that group may feel that he has to sacrifice something. If he was not a part of the team, maybe he would have done things differently. But you decide to abide by it. The second set of questions that comes up, that if this is the concept of governance, what is the role of government and statutory bodies in this? Why can't we just let teams decide what they want to do and leave it to them? So, in more technical terms, This is a question of self-regulation versus regulation by statutory authorities. And as human society has got more and more complex, people have realized that self-regulation is good, but not sufficient. We need some statutory authority which will enforce rules. So you just take a simple example. Contracts have existed in the world for virtually as long as human beings have existed. But law of contracts came only recently in human history. So what were people doing? The traders used to form their own guilds. And they would have their own set of rules as to how should the members behave with each other. And if the contract was broken, the guild threw the trader out. But then you started trading outside the boundaries of the guild. You had contracts which spanned different societies, different countries, and so on. And then the issue started coming up, how do we regulate this? Because it was not sufficient for a guild by itself to have those rules, but you needed an overarching authority. You also sometimes have rogue elements within the guild who have attained so much power that the guild now no longer has the ability to throw that member out. And the member takes advantage of this. You need a higher authority to do this. A family has its own rules. It has its governing structure. The governments by and large don't intervene in it. But is that entirely true? Not in some of the advanced countries. There are very strict laws about how children can be treated by their parents. And the state will intervene if there is a complaint that those children have not been treated properly. So, the extent to which the external authority called the government or the statutory regulator will intervene really depends on the cultural context. We don't have such laws in India. So no state authority enters my household and says that you did not treat your child properly. Because we still at that stage of evolution where we believe that parents are good enough to do this, and this is not a subject for the state to intervene. So the short point here is that there will be self-regulation, there will be regulation by statutory authorities, but the extent to which the statutory authorities come in and occupy that space will depend on the cultural context and the evolution of a particular society or a particular system. So why corporate governance? Companies have evolved over a period of time like many other evolutions. And their activities have become so widespread and so complex that it is no longer about just letting the company to have its own rules of governance. And this has been driven from different angles. Somebody told you that listed companies have a higher responsibility. Why? Because we evolved a structure whereby you could go to the public and ask for them to contribute to your equity. And when we said that, those people needed liquidity, so we set up stock exchanges where they could sell those equities. And as you evolve these structures, the need for regulation from outside became more and more apparent. At the base of it all, it is a question of balance. Because when structures get complex, there are conflicting or competing interests that struggle to find their own space. And you need to evolve a good balance if you are coming in as an outsider, as a regulator, as a government. to make sure that both interests are taken into account, and especially if one interest has the ability to push its point of view through, then you need to make sure that that's not misused. You cannot take away that authority, but you have to make sure that that is not misused. One of the mechanisms through which the regulatory or governmental agencies do this is by creating gatekeepers. And for the longest time, one of the gatekeepers has been the auditors. So as your shareholding expanded, people needed to know that what you are saying in your accounts is true and fair. And we needed an outside agency to come in and certify that. And for the auditors to be able to do that, we had this confidentiality clause between the auditors and the corporates, because the corporate is exposing too much of its material to the auditors. And this worked well for some time. But if you see now, increasingly, there are questions about the limit of this confidentiality. So where systemically important financial institutions are concerned, regulators are saying, we want to talk directly to the auditors. We want to ask them whether they saw something in that institution which is not illegal, but it raises a red flag in their minds. Should the auditors breach confidentiality and talk to the regulators? After the 2008 crisis, the answer all over the world is yes. There is no confidentiality as far as the regulator is concerned. The regulators will talk independently to the auditors, and in most of the advanced countries, this is done as a regular exercise. Let us say the auditor, during the course of his work, comes across some acts done by the company that, according to him, may be criminal or illegal in nature. Now, where are the limits to confidentiality? Is the auditor entitled to share this information with the law enforcing authorities? Is he not merely entitled but obligated to share this information with the authorities? Are questions that are being raised over the world. We had a raging debate on this in the Ethics Committee of the International Institution for Accountants, but finally the vote has been in favor of saying that confidentiality doesn't extend to likely illegal acts. And internationally, the standard that has been adopted is that the auditors have a duty first to report this fact to the managers of the company, those in charge of management, and if they, in their opinion, find that these managers are not ready to take adequate action, they can even report to the concerned legal authorities. One question that was raised regarding auditors here was, what if an auditor decides that he wants to resign midway through his duties? Is he obligated to disclose those reasons to the regulator, or the incoming auditor, or the public at large? Not easy to decide, but you know that there is something inherently wrong with an auditor just leaving the place and a new auditor coming in. The shareholders need to know something more. The management knows, but the shareholders don't know. So the balance of interest between the management and the shareholders has gone awry somewhere. And we need a resolution of this. I don't pretend to know that I have answers for all these questions. I'm raising these questions for you to illustrate to you that even if you have appointed gatekeepers, there are complex issues that you need to deal with. There are competing requirements that you need to resolve. So there is the requirement that auditor keeps confidentiality, and there is the requirement that shareholders get transparent information. And we need to create a balance between. The other gatekeepers are of late in the news for wrong reasons are the credit rating agencies. So common investor is asking, why is it that credit rating agencies downgrade a company only after the disaster has happened? The credit rating agencies are complaining that once a company has obtained whatever credit rating it wanted at the time of issue, it doesn't come back with any information, refuses to cooperate with them. So what is the solution? Do we need to require these credit rating agencies, the moment they do not get information, to say so publicly? That look, this management is refusing to cooperate. So at least you would have raised a red flag. We don't know. SEBI may be thinking of many other solutions. But as I said, the short point is that mere appointment of gatekeepers is not enough. We need to resolve fairly complicated issues. I talked about a balance between competing interests. And over a period of time, these have become fairly complex. Minority shareholders versus promoters, owners versus managers, higher management versus employees, and more topical now is owners plus managers versus the environment. So maybe the activity that the company is doing is legal. The owners and managers are going in the same direction, but is that activity environmentally sustainable? So we are now saying that what a company does is not just for the shareholders or for the prospective shareholders, so disclosures, but for the society at large. And the society at large may be affected by what they're doing. And therefore, increasingly, you find the world over an emphasis on sustainability reports. This has still not become mandatory in most parts of the world. But my guess is that as time goes on, this is going to be a very important issue. And sooner rather than later, the regulators or the governments will get into this area. That brings me to the question of self-regulation versus regulation. Unfortunately, the trend, I won't say unfortunately, but the trend in the recent years has been that self-regulation has been derided. It has lost its space. People have lost faith in self-regulation. So for the longest time, the audit profession considered itself as a profession. The outside world also considered it as a profession. And therefore, regulating that profession was left to the auditors themselves. And now this has been rejected all over the world. And people have said that we need independent auditors, an independent regulator who will regulate the auditors. India has been among the probably 50th or 60th country to join that. But this movement has started all over the world. Another profession which self-regulates in many parts of the world is the lawyers. And in UK, the faith in self-regulation is gone. So they have set up an independent authority to regulate the lawyers. So self-regulation is good and will sustain itself as long as it carries the confidence of the society. The moment it puts the interests of its own members ahead of the environment, ahead of the investors, ahead of the surroundings, it will lose itself and the government will step in. My thought on this is that even if the government steps in, I think self-regulation has an important role to play. And it is unfortunate that many times when the government step in, the members withdraw. And they say that, look, as long as I am compliant with your regulations, that's it. There's no need for self-regulation here. I think self-regulation still has a role to play, because the environment is constantly changing. And nobody is aware of the changes that are taking place more than the members themselves. It will take some time for regulators or governmental authorities to catch up. And here, if the self-regulation is in a position to set guidelines ahead of time for its members that are reasonable from the perspective of doing that business and are contemporary in terms of the latest developments, then you will find that even if the government steps into that area, it will probably adopt those guidelines more or less as a law or as a regulation. If you don't do it and there is a public outcry, you will have the scenario of what I would term as ham-handed regulation. You will complain that these guys sitting there do not understand what business is all about, they are making impractical rules, and so on. And the regulator will push back and say that you guys didn't do anything when you had an opportunity to do it. And now a disaster is on my hands. And I need to handle that. So I think this is an area where self-regulation has a very interesting and very positive role to play. And I hope that all organizations which resist regulation by state or regulators, when they do come under the regulatory purview, will not lose their way and will not take an attitude that now the regulator is there to regulate, we have nothing to do. I think we need to still preserve that structure for a good reason. I made a point in passing that all changes that you make in governance have a cultural history and a cultural background to it. And it is good for the regulators and governmental agencies to remember that change cannot come overnight. So if we want to change something in a structure, we have to have the patience and the understanding of how that structure is working today and what steps do we need to take in order to reach the goal that we want to. Patience in understanding that I have taken only one step and I may be criticized that the goal is too far up, but the understanding that I am going to take the next step and the next step. When finally this is done, people will say, okay, job well done. I'm reminded of, again, an example that was there in the earlier presentation, what used to happen in our IPOs. Now, many of you are so young that you may not even know about this. There was a time when the time limit for a company to issue shares and refund money to the shareholders was 90 days. So after the public issue closed, legally they were allowed to take 90 days to do the allotment, and refund money to the investors. The reason given was that those were the days of all paperwork, no automation. So naturally it took time. India is a vast country and so on. So in my early days in SEBI, the first stint, I was appointed as a director on the Bombay Stock Exchange as a SEBI representative. So I just asked them, can you give me a list of all the IPOs that were made in the last 3 years and whether the money has been refunded to the investors and allotment has been done? What time did it take to do this exercise? And to my horror and to your surprise, that list had many companies which for as long as a year and a half had neither done the allotment nor had refunded money to the shareholders. So from there, we have come to a stage where within a week everything is over. The shares are listed, people can trade, monies are refunded, and so on. Now this reform could not have happened overnight. We had to set goals for people which were intermediate goals. And that was not a very happy situation to say that, okay, you are taking 210 days, now take 45 days. Even 45 days is a long time. We knew that. But you had to have the patience to say that even if you bring it to 45 days, I am happy. I'll tell you the next target after you've reached 45 days. I don't want to hassle you. Look at the governance of the settlement mechanism in the stock exchanges. The same thing. 45 days to settle because 30 days of trading, 15 days of trading, so-called 15 days to settle, which used to stretch to any amount. So initially when the foreign investors came here, one of them, with a sense of humor, asked me, what is your system? It is T plus what? And we had never heard of T plus anything. So we had to tell them that it is T plus whatever. There is no T plus here. To get the stock exchanges to move from a 15-day settlement to a weekly settlement took, say, about 3 to 4 years. But again, you had to have the patience to do that because at that time there were no depositories, banks were not computerized, trades used to come from all over the country, so the share certificates had to travel to the stock exchange and back to the buyers and so on. So you had to understand these difficulties, get people moving, get them to an intermediate target. Finally, in short, reform is a long process. Sometimes it's a messy process, but you have to have the courage and the patience to deal with it. The last question, which actually relates to the title of this seminar, is will investor go for companies with good governance, or would they rather buy shares of companies who are making good profits? Now, to my mind, this question is a wrongly framed question because it assumes that those companies which have good governance do not make good profits, or that somehow these are two separate buckets. They are not. So I believe that people will go for good governance as well as good profits, not either or. And increasingly, the other gatekeepers are also coming into operation. Just as you were told, now there are large holdings in companies of not just minority shareholders, but institutional shareholders who have the power to say yes or no and get the management to rethink. To help these institutional investors along the way, we have the proxy advisors who will advise these companies on what is their recommendation about how they should be voting. And their importance in the market is going up. So the managements are becoming alert to this idea that 2 or 3 proxy advisors giving a negative opinion on what they want to do is asking for trouble. which is a good thing. As I said, it's an evolutionary process. It will take its own time, but this issue will remain interesting for some time, that would people choose companies making a lot of profits but have bad governance over companies which are making moderate profits with good governance. My take is that the balance is tilting in favor of looking at the quality of governance. You will probably discuss this issue among the many things that you will during the day. I wish you very happy and substantive discussions, and thank you again for the patience to hear me out. Thank you very much.
Can you tell us some incidences where this pressure and how you broke through this pressure in making your decisions or implementing the decisions?
So I don't know whether I have a direct answer to this question, but if you were to ask me to sum up as to what is the change in capital markets that has happened after SEBI coming into being from 1992, just tell us one thing. So I won't tell you depositories, I won't tell you stock exchange automation and so on. I will just say that focus on investor interest. Because as Mr. Pathak rightly said, the governments and the regulators are not easily accessed by the common investors or the common people. The corporates, the intermediaries, they have the ability to influence the thinking of the regulator far more than the small investors have. And therefore, it is incumbent on the regulator to make sure that it goes and seeks out the pain points of small investors. And one of the things that was done by SEBI to get over this problem was to have investor interactions at regular intervals. So we had a lot of investor associations that were recognized by SEBI. I used to make it a point that every quarter, once, I met all the associations together. Now, never mind the fact that some of the associations were not really representing investor interests. Fake associations formed by some people. But when you gather a group of 20, 30 people, you have to deal with the fact that many of them are sincere, some of them may be insincere. It is up to you as a person sitting in authority to sift out the relevant from the irrelevant, or the self-interest driven from the general market interest. I personally found that very useful. I think the other thing that public servants need to do is to keep their doors open. Whoever comes to meet you, you must meet that person and not think of it as a waste of time. Anybody seeks an appointment, you are very busy, give an appointment after a week, after 15 days, doesn't matter. Because you never know what insight you are going to get from what the person across the table is telling you. And those insights can be extremely valuable. I think these two things are good. Just to add one more aspect to it, always listen to criticism. While in power, there is a tremendous temptation to give more time to people who come to you and say nice things. But people come to you and say nice things because They want to get something out of you. They have got something pending in your organization. They want you to expedite it. So they are bound to come and say nice things to you. But what is the incentive for a person who comes and tells you that something is going wrong in your policies? Virtually zero. If despite that he is coming and telling you that, I think he is a person worth listening to. And this is not just for public servants. Many of you are young. You will be sitting in positions of authority. Even in the private world, this is crucial. In fact, in Marathi, this is Pune, so many people may be familiar with Marathi. There is a proverb which says, Nindakache ghara asave shezari. So let my critic be my neighbor. If that criticism is motivated or not based on facts, you can always discard it. But shutting your ears to criticism can be the worst thing that any person in authority can do. That's a long answer to a question, sorry.
So we can take a couple of questions, and I think two representative questions I'll try to take. One is about the governance at the regulator himself. So if you have any comments on that, 3-4 questions have come on this part.
So who governs the people in charge of governance? That is your question. Now, you can go on asking this question and go on building pyramids. One more authority, who then governs that authority, and so on. So at the end of it all, you have to trust that whichever authority you have considered as the topmost will act in good faith. I mean, who will govern the parliament? Who will audit the CAG? These are questions to which there are no practical answers. The only answer to this in terms of the governing structure is, if we can make the process through which the person heading that organization is appointed robust, and you get the right person there, you will have the organization running well. Otherwise, we will keep building blocks to which there is no end. So, in a sense, it will have to be self-regulatory at some stage. The accountability in such institutions comes from the fact that there is somebody who appoints you. Even in a parliament, every 5 years, people have to elect you. So if you do things that are not considered by the electorate as appropriate, you are going to get thrown out. If you don't perform as a regulator, the government is going to do something about it, because that is the appointing authority. So all of us have appointing authorities, but ultimately you have to trust somewhere.
The second question is regarding auditors and rating agencies. The question is, are they being made the scapegoats or punching bags? And I'll add one part to that. Are they loyal to the paymasters? And do you think this situation can be changed?
Okay, interesting question. I think it is possible in certain circumstances that they can be made punching bags, and people who actually are responsible may try to divert attention of the public by saying, no, not me, this fellow was not behaving properly. That's why there is chaos here. So that is a possibility. But some of the cases that have come up are so glaring that it is difficult for these professions to completely disown responsibility. I mean, you talked of Satyam. The case, I think, is still sub judice. But there is a clear instruction by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India that an auditor must verify the cash balance, as simple as that, nothing complicated, of a corporate independently with the banks. So the standard procedure is that the auditor takes a letter from the management authorizing him to inquire with the bank what the balances are, and the bank is authorized to communicate directly with him. If for 28 quarters you don't do this basic thing, and we have to go back and tell the investors that look, what cash balance was shown on the company's accounts doesn't exist to the extent of 5,000 crores. Who will you look at if not the auditors? And the difficulty with the audit profession that has got aggravated over a period of time is that the auditors have developed different lines of revenue. And the revenue that comes from consulting is a huge part of that revenue stream. Probably they have gone a step further and they have started subsidizing the auditing part with the revenues that they get from, let's say, commercial activities. And this creates a conflict which is real. Some of the inspections that the European audit authorities had carried out, they found that the audit partners had targets in terms of the consulting revenue or the non-audit revenue that the partners had to generate out of their auditing assignments that they got. So that structure is problematic. The world has not yet found a complete solution to that. Some companies are going in the direction of saying that a company which audits cannot earn consultancy revenue. So they have ordered the Big Four to segregate these into two different companies. The difficulty is that the corporates on their own would not want their audit fees to go up. So they are very happy to make these audit firms compete and give them the lowest quote. Whereas the real auditor's job will require much more money. But many times it may not be in the management's interest for the auditor to do a real audit job. So it's a very vexing and complicated question. As I said, we don't have an answer to it, but the paymaster issue that you brought in is part of this. The paymaster is not actually the audit part of it, but it is the rest of the business that has been developed. Hopefully we will find an answer to it. Probably in different countries, different experiments will go on. The world will figure out which one works and which one doesn't work. But this is a very important issue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.